All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's good to see a couple familiar faces out there. What up, Dave? I'll try to keep, for Kirsten's sake, my potty mouth to an absolute minimum during this talk. She always worries about that when I give any type of public presentation. So my name is Cliff Lampe. I am a professor here in the Department of Telecommunication, Information Studies, and Media, working also with ag bio research on some social media projects. And I study a lot of social media, and I sometimes foolishly decide to try to create a social media project, which usually goes terribly wrong, and sometimes goes very right. And I study a lot of basically what are the effects of our participation in these types of sites. As part of that, I've often studied what are the effects of social media in businesses. Most of my work has been done with Microsoft and IBM, which aren't really typical businesses because they tend to be a little tech savvier than, like, say, my wife's work at the County of Washtenaw or things like that. So it's a different scenario, but they definitely have, I think, led the bleeding edge of what some people can do with some of these social media projects. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I have a PhD in information from the University of Michigan and describe myself as an old school nerd, which means I've been studying social media since, like, we just called it the internet back in the early days, back when it was just, your BBS and your MUDs and your Usenet. How about BBS people? Raise your hand. Anybody? All right, there's some old school folks with me. MUDs? Well, just Ethan. Yeah, a couple of you. All right. So research on social media, and I consider myself primarily a researcher, which my students in my classes also consider me primarily a researcher. That's a joke, like I'm a bad teacher. Don't worry, we'll get there. So the research that takes place on social media happens in multiple areas, right? So multiple academic disciplines are currently studying what are the effects of social media use in the workplace and beyond. So business schools obviously have taken this up to a large extent, lots of good research going on there. The computer industry is really interested in this, especially those computer scientists who are interested in human factors, which is about 1% of computer scientists, and studying how basically people interact on social media sites. There's also a bunch of work going on in industry research labs. So a lot of your large social media companies, like Yahoo, for instance, yes, Yahoo is still around, and actually is still a really big company, has a lot of people who study primarily social media going on. So, like, for instance, Flickr is owned by Yahoo, Yahoo Personals, and things like that. So there's really active social media research going on at Yahoo. Microsoft studies a lot of social media, especially social media in the workplace. IBM, which we don't tend to think of as a social media company, has 3 labs across North America that study social media. One in White Plains, New York, one in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one in Minnesota. So there's quite a bit of work that they do, and they often create social media sites. So they're responsible for sites like Many Eyes. Many Eyes is a visualizer. You basically plug in a CSV file or any type of data file that you have, and they'll do really cool visualizations of your data. So you can see, like, bubble graphs and things like that. They also created Dog Ear, which is a bookmarking site. They study a lot of they have this phrase, they eat their own dog food. So they study a lot of social media sites by basically implementing them at IBM and seeing how much they like it. There's also a ton of academic industry partnerships. So for instance, Facebook recently, Facebook is a large social network site for those of you who have been living in a cave for the past 5 years. Facebook recently started their own research labs, and so they're hiring up tons of PhD students. One of our visiting scholars here at Michigan State, Andrew Fiore, is one of their latest hires. He's going to go work there starting this fall, using his expertise in large-scale data analysis to study social interactions on Facebook. We're doing a project with Facebook right now as part of an industry academic research relationship about how are people using Facebook in particular to study or to seek information, right? So do you ask questions through your Facebook status updates? What types of questions do you ask? Are they questions where you really want answers, or are they questions where you're fishing for some emotional support? Things like that. So we're doing a lot of work in that area. As part of that, we actually did a study recently of a lot of MSU administrators. Some of you might have participated in that study, staff people? No? All right, well, we'll get you next time. And there we were looking a lot about how people were using Facebook at work, right? So how are people using Facebook basically at the workplace, especially here at Michigan State University? And there's a lot of controversy about using Facebook at work and a lot of people's concerns about Facebook at work that we'll go into a little bit. So a lot of this work is done in interactions. This is just kind of a little bit of marketing with the Online Interaction Lab here in ComArts. This is a group of researchers and graduate students who study basically the effects of social media, both including in the workplace plus more generally. So one of the things I wanted to consider, just to jump us off and get into these other conversations, is what's different about social media, right? What are the things that we think of as being really kind of new about this technology? Because not everything's new, right? So people are still people, no matter what channel they're communicating on. There's a lot of real consistent things that we find. And we see, especially when you look at the old media, when you look at the traditional media and what they say about social media, they said the same thing about radio when it first came out, and they said the same thing about TV and papers and everything else. All forms of media kind of go through these cycles, but there are some new things. One of the things that's really changing is the ubiquity of hardware and software available to people, right? One of the things that kind of matched the availability of social media was actually the availability of cheaper hardware. A flip camera costs, what, $100? Before the dumb sons of bitches cut out the flip camera as a product. So that makes shooting video, and your phones, how many of you have a phone right now that can shoot video or take pictures, right? That means that basically all of us are turned into media creators, right? It's not just that the software has changed over the past few years, but hardware has actually made some remarkable strides over the past 10 years. I actually found my cell phone from 10 years ago. It's like that big. It's crazy. All right, another big change, why this is somewhat different, is storability of information once we create it, right? So we create all these digital objects. You take a video of yourself skating off your roof on your camera phone, and you want to put that up onto YouTube. Well, now there's a copy of that. And once we have a copy of something, actually really interesting things can happen, right? When you have copies of things, you actually can send those things to someplace else, right? You can post them in multiple locations. That thing can stay around for quite a while. Somebody else can take that thing and really repurpose it. So copies and the availability of cheap copies are a huge change over the past few years. And then I also talk about computability, right? One of the things that's easy to forget about with these social media sites is that they happen mostly through computing platforms. And when you have computing platforms, you can compute on them. So for instance, on Facebook, how many here are Facebook users in general? Good portion of you guys. Ethan, I know, don't even look Canadian cranky at me. So with Facebook, the news feed is a really integral part of Facebook, right? The news feed is actually a computational algorithm trying to detect what you're going to find interesting. Not every one of your friends shows up in your news feed, right? Facebook has a lot of computation behind that, trying to figure out what you're going to find compelling. So that's a way that computers are actually driving the social interaction. Most of what this does is it reduces the cost of interactivity in these sites. You know, how many of you have more than 300 Facebook friends? Less than have a Facebook account. So before, trying to keep up with 300 people would be an onerously costly task, right? When we look at social media use in the business, this is also seen as one of the benefits of using social media within businesses. It's basically a way of reducing transaction costs, or a way of reducing the cost of trying to interact with one another. And that's been one of the big changes about social media, is that it provides a relatively cheap way for people to interact. So just a couple of trends I wanted to go over, some things that might frame how we think about social media coming up. So right now in the United States, about 74% of people have internet access either at home or at work. 65% of people have access to broadband. 26% of people comment on online content. 67% of people watch video online. And okay, so 85% of adults have a cell phone. 59% of people access the internet wirelessly, either through smartphones or through internet Wi-Fi enabled laptops. 84% of 18 to 29-year-olds access the internet primarily through these wireless types of hardware. 7% of adults have tablets, like an iPad, like Ethan's carrying over here. How many of you have a tablet right now? About 7%, well, a little more for this size audience. 28% of people access news from their cell phones. Only 4% of people are using location-based services, right? Location-based services include things like Foursquare and Gowalla. How many here are a location-based service user, Gowalla, Foursquare? So about 4%, a little bit more than that. So again, these are technologies. I see the mobility and the location awareness as being important trends moving forward, especially for businesses. So these are things we like to keep track of, but that's one of the trends we'll talk about in a little bit. So when we look at the business case for social media use and how businesses can use social media, and I would expand businesses to be more broad. I would also think about in terms of nonprofit organizations, including academic organizations. Basically, any organization that wants to use social media has a couple of parameters that they really want to consider, right? So one is about an audience. right? Is your social media efforts targeted towards an internal audience or an external audience or both? Would you have the same strategy for an internal audience that you would for an external audience? So I'm doing a bunch of work for the Office of the Vice President for Research right now about how researchers at Michigan State University use social media for scientific collaboration. Right? Now that's a pretty cool topic, but it turns out they don't use a lot of social media other than email, the original and best form of social media that we still have out there. So for them, they're interested in this internal audience. How can we collaborate better using social media? We also, of course, and many of you in this room probably have some interest in external audiences, right? So we have an organizational mission and organizational news and everything else about our organization that we want to send out to people. We want more to be aware of what's going on here. And that's a very different audience with a very different set of needs. When I've worked with a lot of, especially nonprofit organizations, they tend to confound those needs sometimes, right? They tend to, or there's those audiences. So how can we keep those separate, and how would your strategies for using social media differ by whether you're targeting an internal or an external audience? Once you figure out your audience, you then have a bewildering and sometimes overwhelming array of tools to choose from. So one example of things you could do, and this is kind of a range from most costly to least costly sort of, is the homebrew method. You sit down with your PHP or Java skills, with a Z on skills there, and you start coding out your own social media platform, right? You don't like how anybody else does it, so you're going to start from scratch and do it yourself. Well, that kicks ass in terms of you being tough and everything, but it's also going to be hugely expensive. You know, you're going to have to pay actual programmers, and you're going to have to find designers and UI designers and UX designers and do some usability analysis and do the whole 9 yards. All of that's going to end up costing you quite a bit of money. There are people who have already made that investment for you, and they will sell you a nice commercial product, a platform that you can use to just install, right? It's kind of out of the package. We'll load it up. You get an account on this server with X number of gigabytes of download per month, and you're good to go. You're ready. You're off to the races and ready to go. This is also relatively expensive, right? Because all these other people, this company that you're buying this from, have already done all this stuff with the usability analysis and the UX design and making the colors pretty and everything like that. So they're just now offloading that to you, the client. Their broad services are kind of a mix of two things, right? You have open source platforms, your content management systems like Drupal, WordPress, Joomla, Bitweaver. There's probably some cooler, hotter things out there that I'm not thinking of. And then you have kind of the big, what I think of as cloud services, or big kind of open platforms like Facebook, Twitter, MySpace. MySpace still exists and is actually still fairly active, despite popular rumor. And services like that, right? And now this is a person who's in charge of social media for their company or for their organization, nonprofit, is faced with this set of choices. Do we create our own? Probably not, it's too expensive. But even if we go through and just use these cloud services, do we use Facebook or Twitter? Do we use Facebook and Twitter? Do we separate our messages between Facebook and Twitter? Do we tie our accounts together? What about LinkedIn? You know, what kind of platform do we want there? So this is a kind of a large set of choices that people have available to them in terms of how do they promote their organization through these social media platforms that are available. If you're going to use a site like Drupal for an internal audience, there's also a huge cost with that, right? Because Drupal comes out of the package ready to go. WordPress is great, but it takes huge amounts of investment in terms of customization and actual effort to get it ready for any sort of serious mission. So what do businesses and organizations in general worry about when they start thinking about social media, either for internal or external audiences? And I think most of us have a fairly intuitive sense of this, and the actual literature on what businesses worry about bears this out for the most part. One big thing that especially managers worry about is wasting time, right? That if we allow people to access Facebook at work, what's going to happen is that basically it's going to devolve into a series of people texting each other, asking each other to be neighbors in Farmville, and sending pictures of their weekend back and forth over these media, right? That everybody has at least heard that problem in the past and is worried about it. On the other hand, you have workers who are worried about being perceived as wasting time by using social media. Right? So a lot of people, even in organizations that try to promote social media use, you have a lot of workers who have gone through other cultures who have a hard time accepting that, yes, we actually really do want you to use social media. So this is kind of this dichotomy of we want these benefits from social media, but we're going to lock down Facebook because we don't want people wasting time on Facebook. I did a bunch of work with Spectrum Health last year where this was pretty much their model, right? They had a very aggressive Facebook and Twitter strategy. They really wanted to reach out to clients and services providers and everybody else through Facebook and Twitter, but it was absolutely blocked on the actual Spectrum intranet, right? So what did the workers do? They used their cell phones. Right? Absolutely, that's what they did. They hopped on the 3G network and just used their cell phones to access Facebook and Twitter. Or they hopped on the guest wireless network and swamped that using Facebook and Twitter. So in most of the cases where these things are attempted to be clamped down, people usually find a way, like weeds springing up through cracks in cement, to find a way to access social media. All right, another thing that businesses and organizations worry about is losing control. And losing control can mean a lot of different things, and it depends on the audience, right? So if you're a journalist, for instance, losing control could mean that the comments that you're receiving in your stories are what many of us worry about when we see comments in news stories, right? Or if you're a corporate client, sometimes they worry about what's being said about my product. There's been a lot of research about how do you manage comments in social media that are unflattering about your product. The conventional wisdom and the thing that's really devolved from what we understand today is you own it, right? Like the best thing to do if somebody's really criticizing your product is to own that criticism and respond to it. Time and time again, the research has shown that that's the most effective strategy because for every person who comments on a site, you have 1,000 other eyeballs who see that comment and see your response to that comment. So comments really matter, and interaction really matters, but we rarely think about the audience for those comments and those interactions. This is, another big worry is opportunity cost, and what else should we be spending our money on, right? So if I am going to spend, let's create a random number, $100,000 on a social media campaign for this organization, what else could I be doing with $100,000? That's a huge worry. And this is where we get into what John's hopefully going to talk about in a little bit, which are metrics of success for social media, right? It is very tricky and hard to figure out exact measures of success for social media. We can come up with great stories, and those are really valuable, and I think they do provide good evidence. But it depends on what we really think of as a metric. John, I don't want to steal any of John's thunder on this. I don't know what he's going to say. But for instance, if I was involved on a project that Dave might remember where we were asked to show that we had created jobs in a region in Michigan through the use of social media, right, by promoting that region on social media. That is just too multivariate a dependent variable to really think about in terms of showing social media effectiveness, right? There's too many things that go into job creation for us to have an understanding of how that actually works. So that's an incomplete list. Obviously, employers and organizations worry about more than that, but I wanted to move on to some necessary conditions for adoption. How, if you're going to use social media either for that internal or external audience, what do you need to do? One is to remember that's an interactive media. Right? There's a lot of people who use social media sheerly for micro broadcast and sheerly to try to get a word out, but this is something where you have to respond and you have to get the message back and forth to people. If you don't do that, people are just going to tune out because, have you ever had a friend, and I've had these friends, I'm trying to think if I've ever been this friend, where you're having a conversation with them and all they do is talk, and no matter what you say, they're bulletproof, they just don't react, they just keep going. That's what it sounds like in a social media channel when it's just messages going out and no messages coming in. You have to avoid BS in these social media channels. People detect it super easily, right? If you have 1,000 eyeballs looking over social media messages, one of those people is going to be able to detect when you're being fake or when you're being ingenuine or when you're telling lies outright. And they're going to be able to spread that word to others. So it's really important to be able to be genuine. One of the big successes in marketing for use of social media was the Old Spice campaign on social media. Everybody remembers that? Well, one of the big successes of that was that they gave a very genuine, authentic voice that sounded like social media use. Now, I've heard sometimes people say that if you're over 25, 26, that number keeps changing, you speak social media with an accent, right? And that's why that job often gets pushed into younger people in your audience. But I don't think that's true per se. I think it's about investing the time and energy into learning the language, right? You can learn any language if you invest the time and energy. And it's the same with social media. All right, encouraging user contribution is a huge issue, and I think it's the kind of killer thing with social media projects. Everybody creates these social media platforms and tries to crowdsource and tries to get people to participate. And I think the golden idea when you walk in is, we're going to create this awesome social media channel, and all these people whom we know love us because we send them email all the time are going to flock in and fill us up with their great stories and their great wisdom, and it's going to be awesome, right? That rarely, if ever, happens. It's just very hard to get people to participate in user-generated content sites or social media more generally. A small percentage of people contribute. And we have consistent evidence over multiple social media platforms that there's a long tail effect. The majority of people do not contribute to social media campaigns. Even something as large as Wikipedia, which the myth of Wikipedia is that everybody contributes to Wikipedia, 98% of Wikipedia is contributed by 1% of people who've ever visited Wikipedia, right? It's a long tail effect. It's found in every single one of these. I've been involved in many a project where people have said, well, our audience isn't like that. We're going to get more participation because this audience is really super motivated and super interested in this topic, and they love us so much that they're going to jump in, and we're going to have 90% of people participate in our social media site. I think I've been involved in a dozen of those projects, and it always fails, right? I don't know why it is. Nobody understands this quite yet, but it's a power law distribution of participation. My rule of thumb is that for every one person you want to contribute, you need 1,000 eyeballs on your channel. All right, breakdown of intuition. When we design these things and when we put them together, you have this kind of unholy combination of engineers, usability people, UI designers, social scientists, content experts who are all thinking about, what does my audience really think and want, right? Here's how I use social media. This must be how everybody uses social media. I don't like social media, so I can't imagine anybody responding to social media. I like it when Twitter does this, so we should make a site that does that. It is amazing how much of the design and implementation of social media is based off of real gut feeling kinds of interactions. Now, this is fixable. You can do a lot of usability testing up front. That's still not going to be perfect, but it will get you closer. But it's really hard to build for kind of a diverse audience, which is the next point, which is about how do you design for diversity, right? I think when everybody puts these things together, they have this ideal user in their head, right? This ideal user is somebody who has super interesting, witty things to say, who's never going to be negative, who's going to participate consistently and be an expert in using all of the technology that we want them to use. Now, if that person actually existed, they'd be invited to every cocktail party in the universe, because I don't know anybody who's consistently witty and fun and says all those nice things. So how do you design for those users who are not so nice, or who just want to throw off a one-liner, or users who don't want to say anything, but they're willing to help other users by contributing ratings or things like that? How do you design for users who are uncomfortable with the technology but still want to contribute? Or how do you design for users who are super users who need more bells and whistles? When we look at a site like Facebook, this is research that we've seen again and again on Facebook. Everybody thinks that Facebook users are exactly like them. When you look at how you think other people use Facebook, you typically think, well, most people use it like I do. No, we have cataloged at least 35, 40 different ways that people use Facebook. There are some people who only go to Facebook to play Farmville. There are some people who only go to Facebook to post pictures. So this scales up when you're talking about organizations, right? IBM has faced this problem a lot. How do they have a site that serves both the needs of their engineers and the needs of their accounting people and their needs of salespeople, which salespeople are a wholly different species altogether, especially compared to accountants and engineers, right? So how do you design for those types of diversity and have one platform that speaks to that? And that's both a content and tech design strategy. And then I'll leave John to talk more about measurable outcomes, but how do we measure, did this affect mission? I think there are good ways to do this, but you want to have those clear up front, especially for people who you're responsible to. So let me talk about a couple of benefits of business use and then talk a little bit more about the research more generally. So obviously, I think one of the reasons we attempt to do these things in the first place is this big kind of crowdsourcing issue, right? We want to tap into this wide distributed net of people and see some of the same benefits that we've seen occur in other types of social media platforms. So Wikipedia has both been a great and horrific example of social media over the past 10 years, because it does show what the power of the media can be, right? We can create complex, super useful products. How many of you hate Wikipedia? Just a couple. How many of you use Wikipedia on a weekly, if not daily basis? Right. Everybody at this point, if you just look at the sheer numbers, pretty much uses Wikipedia. It's also helped by the fact that it turns up usually in the top 5 for a Google search on almost anything you're going to look for, right? Now that's created all by volunteers, which is great. Now everybody I talk to wants a combination of two things. They want as an organization, they want to create a social media site that has the powerful distributed network of Wikipedia that will allow people to create a complex object through the effort of millions of people, but they want the ease of use of Facebook. Right? So those are the kind of two parameters they think about. How many of you have ever edited a Wikipedia page? Wow, holy crap. That's not my typical response for an audience. It's a pain, right? If you look at it, the Wikipedia pages scare away many people who would otherwise like to contribute, because it involves things like, you know, squiggly marks and like actual characters that aren't English characters necessarily. So a lot of people are actually chased away from contributing to Wikipedia. So those two combinations of factors really are what most people are after. We want to harness this powerful force of people out there who can help us. The other thing we would really like to do is to get people to, I'm going to paint this a little bit negatively, but sometimes people want others to do the work for you, right? We're just going to create this space, and we're going to crowdsource this question, and we're going to basically have a ton of people contribute to this and make this awesome, whatever it happens to be. Information about what our organization should be doing, information about our products, reviews for products. It should be ideas for our next campaign. Basically, it's a way of saying, look, we don't have the resources to answer this question, so we're just going to throw it out there and hope that you do, right? So, but that's a powerful thing. It has worked. More clever strategies for crowdsourcing include like the Grand Rapids Art Prize. Everybody knows about that one, where they basically are interacting with artists and having the population of Grand Rapids and surrounding areas vote on the art. Lots and lots of internal uses for this. So in most of the tech companies I've worked for, they've seen the use of social media largely as a knowledge management service. So they'll go through, there's a site that we worked on in IBM called Beehive. How many employees do you guys think IBM has?
11 bajillion.
11 bajillion is almost exactly correct. It's actually about 450,000 employees across something like 80 countries on pretty much every continent, including sometimes Antarctica. So that's a huge organization that is distributed across a wide range, right? And that's something that they have to really think about. That's my time is up, is what you're saying? Okay. All right, so we'll move into question and answer. Two quick ones. We want people to become more integrated into our organization. That's how IBM used Beehive. They really set it up so that, you know, if I'm in the Indonesian office, I feel more central to IBM culture as if I was in the New York office, you know, kind of thing. At MSU, that's one of the things they want to do with social media. With our Spartan Connect project, which was to help first-year students kind of get integrated into the first-year experience, that was one of the things we were trying to use social media for, was to help them feel more organizational commitment to MSU. We also want to use social media to actually address people in the channels we think they're currently using, right? Like, it's become clear that more and more people are adopting these social media channels. And it's clear that there's a lot of energy and attention out there. And especially for certain audiences, like younger audiences, we really want them to have access to that. So, you know, how do we get them to have access, and how do we get to those people? This is a double-edged sword, right? I've heard a lot of organizations, especially organizations where older people like myself were in charge, who are like, we need to get them kids in our organization. Let's use their Twitter to do that. And of course, that then triggers the inauthentic voice, and you have the whole set of other problems. So those are just a few of the possible benefits and risks and kind of necessary conditions for business use. I think this is a really exciting area. You know, it takes a lot of forethought. It takes a lot of energy and investment. I know many of these people in this room have invested just oodles of time and investment in this. So I'd be happy to hear any comments that you had or things that you think about this. So, yeah.
Any magnitude on those energy and investment expenses?
Yeah, I think if your organization wants to have a social media strategy, you need at least one FTE devoted to that social media strategy. The things that I've seen that rarely work, well, I should say like 1 FTE towards messaging in general, part of which could be a social media strategy. But I think it's more effective if it's somebody's job, right, and not just the interns, right? Somebody needs to be responsible for that, and you know, not necessarily just the 23-year-old kid in the office, but that person's also hugely valuable sometimes. But others might have different ideas who do this more professionally than I do. Yeah.
I had an interesting experience with Dark Horse Comics, where I spent a lot of time just posting on their social media stuff. And recently they had a conversation on Twitter with all of their followers, and I hadn't tweeted a word that night, and I got like 20 mentions because I said something on Facebook. So I felt like I controlled their social media by being so closely associated.
And that's interesting, because one of the things I think businesses can really do, or organizations in general can do, is promote their advocates in the social media sphere, right? So, you know, when you get a sense of that audience that you had, it feels pretty good, right? It feels nice to know people are actually listening to me. And I think too few organizations or companies really take advantage of that to say, wow, right? Like, here's this person, we're promoting what they say. We just did a project with students contributing to Wikipedia, and one of the things they really liked about doing that was they felt like they had this global audience, that their words weren't just going to a professor who would barely read it and throw it into the recycle bin, that somebody was actually paying a huge attention. Attention matters. It's an attention economy. That's the thing to remember about your organizational use of this stuff. You're competing against Hulu, YouPorn, all sorts of crazy sites out there that are demanding people's time and attention, and you really have to fight for that attention and own it, right? And give them reward back for that attention. Right.
Can you think of any companies that you think do a particularly good job of using social media to promote their products or services?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Old Spice had a really good social media campaign that they did. I don't know if they've kept it up. Kirsten might know more about this than I do, but I don't think they've kept it up so well, but it's been a really good one. Tom's Shoes, obviously, given their whole hippie nature, has done a really good job with social media in general. A lot of the clothing companies have done pretty well. A lot of car companies. BMW was an early mover in this market and did an incredible job. GM actually has moved really strongly into this in the past couple of years. They have a new marketing or a social media director, Marcia Hanigi, who's absolutely genius and does a really good job. And so, for instance, their social media efforts around the Volt have been really cohesive and good and really actually pretty excellent. The Mayo Clinic actually does a really good job with social media. There's a guy there we met at a training we did a couple of weeks ago, Lee Asinje. I can't remember his name. No. Yeah, I can't pronounce that politely, but Lee at the Mayo Clinic does just the most incredible stuff. Everybody here remember the YouTube video of the old couple playing piano in the Mayo Clinic lobby? That was his, right? He put that out there. Doesn't, and his, so really good stuff there too. Yeah, a couple companies really, and usually it's a person or small team of persons within those companies who are really pushing that out.